Thank you, everyone. I will start really quickly just to have a very short background on who Berghoff is as an organization, and then we'll jump more particular into the projects that we actually work on, which might be a little more interesting practical examples. Berghoff is an NGO. It's a non-for-profit that actually supports to prevent political and social violence. Now, Berghoff actually was founded in 1971. Interestingly, there's just three parts that I'll touch on, what make it maybe particularly unique compared to other, say, peace institutes that you'll find everywhere else. Originally, it was actually three institutes, and it combined into one. So there was actually a peace education organization back in the day, there was a conflict research, and there was a peace support operation. So now it's actually all one big organization, which means that all the different components actually are able to support each other. So Evelyn here works, for example, on the conflict transformation research team. I work on the peace support projects. But we're able to coordinate, we're able to support each other, and then the research team can actually push forward what the peace support teams are doing as well as peace education. One thing that Berghoff's approach is that conflict itself is actually inevitable. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's that violence itself is obviously a bad thing and can be avoided. Violence itself is not something that actually is necessary for change. So Berghoff itself is focused on creating spaces for people to actually transform the conflicts through obviously non-violent means. The third trait that Berghoff likes to focus on is particularly is local ownership. In all the countries that we work in most major conflict countries, Yemen, Afghanistan, Colombia, the Sudans, there's many, many more, I won't name all of them, but we work with local partners. It's meant to be locally owned. We're not there to create a peace process and we are the ones to implement it, right? This is actually the people themselves. This is their locally owned process. We can support them through technical advice. We can give them comparative lessons from other countries, what worked, what did not. But ultimately, we walk away, right? We're just there to give them support that we can. So following that, Evelyn will now get a little more into the conflict transformation that she's been working on in the last couple of years. And then after that, we'll get back to the peace support that we do in South Sudan.
Thanks, Mike. So just this as a brief introduction to what we're doing at Berghoff, and now I'll tell you a little bit about the research part of our work. So conflict transformation research, as he already said, is one of the key parts of how we innovate our approaches and how we inform the practitioners on the ground of what could maybe be innovative approaches to transform these conflicts. And I'll just briefly tell you what we're currently working on, what the projects are that we're doing, what our approach is, how we work, and then I'll go into a bit more detail about two particular projects. One, which is the latest one that we've just finished, which is about preventing violent extremism in the Western Balkans. And then finally, I'll explain to you my project that I'm working on, which is on the transformation of female combatants in post-conflict settings. I'm not exactly sure what all your particular interest areas are, but these are sort of the issues we're working on. And you can find almost all of our research reports on our website. So if you're more interested in reading up on any of these, feel free to do so. I'll highlight a couple, maybe the second one that's listed here, which is, I think, a particularly interesting one, which is a project that looks at the de-escalation trajectories and dialogue options for Salafi jihadi groups in Mali, Somalia, and Syria. And it's basically trying to understand how we can interact with these quite violent actors, maybe in new ways that we're not currently tapping into. It's a very new field in peace building and conflict transformation. How do we actually engage these actors? Maybe another one briefly is the nexus of peacemaking and constitution building. This is actually a project we're working on together with the United Nations Mediation Support Unit, which looks at what happens when we have a peace agreement in a country and we're moving from the stage of peace process into the stage of state building. And often negotiating a new constitution is a key part of this. And so we're trying to understand how does peacemaking and constitution building work together. And I'll say a bit more about the two last ones in a minute, so I'll skip those for now. To understand the Berghoff approach to conflict transformation research, there's three key points that I want to line out. The first one is, what is our aim? As Mike already said, we want to support the participation of conflict stakeholders in inclusive processes of non-violent resistance and conflict transformation. as he said, like our key principle is that conflict is not inevitable, but we must do it non-violently. So we're trying to work on that. The second part, which I think is really crucial to how we do our research regarding our methods, is that we work, I think in every project exclusively through partnerships and collaboration. This can have various different ways. It can be either with different universities or research organizations around the world. This can be with local partners. For example, I work with ex-combatant organizations in the case countries that I work in, or it can be individual researchers that we have in our network that are experts, for example, on South Sudan and have access to actors that we as researchers based here in Berlin wouldn't have directly. So I think it's very important. And we always try to combine different models of partnership with capacity building. This can be building research capacity or specific skills that are relevant to a particular project. And finally, obviously, we don't just do research for research's sake. So one aspect that was already mentioned is that we inform our practitioners in their work that they do, but we obviously also try to reach out to a wider audience. And this can be through a number of different means. We publish, this is a picture of like also the print publications that we have, but as I said, it's all also online, and we're working on new multimedia ways of disseminating our work through social media and videos, etc. And finally, apart from more usual events like events like this one or conferences, we also hold pilot dialogues with the communities that we're researching. So basically, one of the projects I'll talk about in a second does this by, once they've accumulated their research results, they actually go back into the communities that they're researching in the first place to sort of test the results. Do the people that are affected by this agree with what we found out? Do they think this is useful to their everyday life, or do they think we missed the mark? And this will inform us for future research projects and practice work that we're doing after. So exactly, these pilot dialogues were part of this project, the Western Balkans project on preventing violent extremism. And I think this research project had a very interesting question that can apply to many different contexts, not just the Western Balkans. So what our team was trying to understand is, why are there some communities where a lot of young people start being interested in sort of extremist ideology? They looked at the case of ISIS and religious extremism. Why are there young people in one community that are attracted to this and not in another? What makes one community resilient to violent extremism, and what makes another one vulnerable? So this was what they're looking at, and this is our latest research report, which I'm teasing you to find on our website and have a look at the results. And exactly, so this is the example of when they went back into the villages and actually talked to religious leaders, community elders, local government, etc., to actually find out if people think their results are valid. And this is actually ongoing at the moment. I think members of our team are currently in the Western Balkans doing these dialogues. Right, so now I'll come briefly to the project that I'm currently working on. As was already said in my PhD, I focused on child combatants, so children associated with armed groups, and so I've moved on a little bit, and I'm now looking at women who fight for non-state armed groups. And I'll give you a little bit of background, like how I came to research this, and then I'll tell you a little bit how we're doing it. So I think over the last 20 years, give or take, international actors have realized that there is an advantage to having a more inclusive peace process. This means, for example, including women in the peace negotiations. So women are supposed to have a seat at the table. And we have seen this being successful in some cases, where some women are included. Some constitutions, post-war constitutions, have quotas for separate bodies, etc. So on paper, we have made progress. In practice, when you talk to these women that are supposedly benefiting of these measures, they often don't really feel a real, meaningful participation. And I really like this little cartoon, which is basically, a bunch of guys saying, "Sure, women, you're welcome at the table." But the role of women hasn't really changed, right? They're still taking care of the house, taking care of the children, doing all these things, whilst at the same time being expected to go to the peace table or to contribute to this. So what should we do about this, right? And so this project suggests one group of women that we might want to look at as a particular one to understand how we can transform, tokenistic or on paper participation into meaningful participation. So we look at female combatants. I'll tell you a little bit why. These are two posters. This is from the YPG in Syria, which is a women's only battalion fighting against ISIS. And the second poster you see is from SWAPO in Namibia in the War of Independence. And so why we think looking at female combatants could be an interesting one here, because this is a group of women that have already shown in the past that they have defied gender hierarchies in the societies they live in, right? It's not, let's say, expected behavior for women to join like a rebel movement and go fighting and leave their children behind, right? So we're thinking that maybe we can learn something from the experience of these women and why they chose, to join those groups and what they did there, and see whether this agency that they had during the war can be transformed into agency after the war to contribute to building a more peaceful society. So how do we do this? I'll leave this up here for a second and explain what it is. And I think it's a very innovative approach to doing this. So it's not me that goes into our different context countries. Like we have a couple of pictures here from Nepal, the Philippines, Indonesia, but there are several others. It's not me that goes into these countries to do the research, but instead we find an insider researcher. So this is actually, you can see, this is, for example, our researcher in Indonesia, and this is our researcher in Nepal. These are women who were themselves members of these armed groups that we are interested in researching. So they have fought the war. These are all conflicts that have ended about 10 to 20 years ago. So we can really get a long look at the situation and not just a couple of years after the peace agreement. So these women go and research their own communities. So we can really understand what they are currently thinking about the situation. Has their participation in the conflict helped them afterwards? Were they able to, either be politically active or advance in some way that they weren't able before? Or maybe are they still suffering consequences of the war that inhibits them from being a more active member in society? And we do this through video interviews, because as I said before, one of our aims is to disseminate our research back to the communities that we're researching in the first place. And let's be honest, no one is really interested in reading a 20-page academic paper on this. And so we're producing video interviews, and hopefully maybe a documentary movie at the end, although that's not clear yet. But the idea is these women go around, we gave them a training on filming skills, I did together with a colleague of mine from Colombia, and on research. And currently we're in the stage of gathering data. They're going around interviews. These are some stills from the interviews they have already done. And my first impression is that we're getting some very interesting stories. Again, it's just a teaser because I've just started working on this project. So you'll have to stay tuned, and we're very curious to see what comes out of this. Yeah, so I think this is just a brief summary exactly of the project I just talked about. And I think I'll leave it at that for now on the research part, and I'll hand over back to Mike, who will give you an impression of what it's like to do really hands-on peace work, not just research in a country. So I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Evelyn. All right, so today I'm going to talk a bit about South Sudan. I don't know if there's any people here who know a lot about South Sudan. I'm going to go very quickly through the background and history, so bear with me if I get a bit general. Just try to spare a bit of time so I can get more into what we're actually doing. South Sudan itself is actually the newest country in the world. It, in 2011, became independent from pretty much very beginning of Sudan independence back in the 50s. South Sudan started a civil war. Now, this has started from 1955. This is the first civil war. Went all the way to 1972. They finally had a peace for not very long, about 11 years, and then it collapsed again into civil war. Again, South was fighting for independence, depending on, well, some groups in the South were fighting for a unified Sudan, but for different type of governance style. And they fought all the way until 2005 when there was a comprehensive peace agreement. They finally arranged a situation where they had an election to vote whether people wanted independence or they wanted to stay part of the Sudan. The vote was extremely well turned out. I think it was around 98% voted for independence, not surprisingly, after 40 years of war. And in 2011, there was huge celebrations in Juba. South Sudan had gotten a lot of international attention over the years. A lot of countries, the US and others, are very, very supportive of the Southern movement, independence movement. And so this new country suddenly came about, and a lot of money and a lot of support was thrown at it to try to create this new state. However, very sadly, in 2013, little over 2 years after independence, it collapsed into civil war again, this time internal South-South civil war. Essentially, the very short explanation is that there's a division amongst the elites. The former vice president, he wanted to be president. He declared that he was about to run for presidency in the next election, and the president fired him from his vice presidency. The head of the party itself, the SPLM, which is a political party attached to the movement, also declared that he was going to run for presidency in the next election, and he also got fired from his post as the head of the political party. Now, it didn't immediately lead to conflict, but what it did, it created obviously very significant tensions amongst the elites and within the party itself. They sent some troops to demilitarize the bodyguards of the former vice president, and it started off a clash between them and the bodyguards of the president. It very quickly devolved into targeting and killing of a particular ethnic group, the vice presidents, the Nuer. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed in the capital, Juba. I was there at the time, actually. My wife and I, we were already working in South Sudan for a couple of years before that. There's running battles in the streets, but at the same time, just foreigners, right, we're quite safe. Our risk is very, very low. The poor South Sudanese is caught in the middle. This is a political competition, and civilians who are just trying to live got caught. There was a lot of people killed, thrown into the river. There's a chief I knew, he lived in a house. His house was driven over by a tank. He was crushed. These are people who are just trying to live their life and try to avoid the conflict. Eventually, the vice president fled with his people, and the conflict quickly evolved to other parts of the country. It started off as a political competition. Now, because of the ethnic differences between the president and the vice president, the retaliation was against civilians who belonged to the vice president's group in the very beginning. And so very quickly it turned ethnic. The people, of course, revenged. The people who were the vice president, and particularly the civilians, the community groups in different parts of the country, felt the need to protect their people. And so a lot of them started mobilizing and marching on the capital. Now, that was for two reasons. They would say one was to protect the people there that they felt were continually getting killed, and second, to carry out some sort of vengeance in form of justice as they perceived it. And to be frank, a lot of the fighters involved were civilians. It wasn't actually the fully trained troops. In the very beginning, the splits within the military was most obvious, but the heaviest fighting was often actually between the civilian groups who mobilized. And again, they often have their local reasons, and it needs to be made clear. They don't necessarily have a very strong opinion that the vice president needs to be president, right? This wasn't, they are so committed to that one particular man becoming the president, but they want to feel the fact that they have lots of local issues that are being defined through this conflict. They feel that having the vice president, for example, Riek Machar, take over would protect their community. They wanted safety, they wanted some sort of development. There was a lot of pressure for negotiations. The regional bloc, IGAD, they're the more or less the Horn of Africa region, negotiated the ceasefire and negotiated the new peace process. They signed it in 2015, and they had months and months of debate about bringing the people back in. How do you implement this peace process, particularly the security and governance components? The vice president was coming back in to take over the vice presidency again, same position he had 2 years earlier. And yet, there was huge negotiations on very, very small things because no one really trusted each other. There's a lot of political pressure for them to sign. There wasn't really the political will. People were really quite afraid after the conflict that broke out the first time. They had weeks of negotiations, for example, on how many rocket-propelled grenades the vice president's bodyguard could bring. Was it 11 or was it 7, I think were the numbers. Obviously, those kind of figures are meaningless, but the point being it was anything they could to delay it until they felt they had more security. I was at the time, as we mentioned, I was actually doing a meeting with chiefs from both the tribes, from both the president's tribe and opposition leader's tribe. And we were trying to set up this first peace meeting with the local leadership, with the local communities, after the conflict had broken out in country. The opposition leader, Riek Machar, his people group, the New Era, the chiefs wouldn't fly until he was back in the capital. So we had a good 3 days waiting on our airplanes to pick up the chiefs until he finally landed. And the second he landed at the airport, we got the permissions. We could send our airplane to pick up the chiefs to bring them for this intercommunal dialogue. It lasted only a few months. He came in about April 2016, and in July, fighting broke out again between the bodyguards of the president and the vice president. They're actually in the middle of a meeting, the two of them, in the presidential palace. And it's hard to say exactly what happens. Of course, everyone has different narratives. But they started shooting. The vice president's people were outnumbered and got wiped out. And the president actually escorted him back. He actually sent his own bodyguards to send him back to his base in the capital. But within a day, the vice president's troops retaliated, started targeting some government people, and then it escalated very quickly into another civil war. The vice president at the time fled all the way to Congo and DRC. It took him a few weeks. A lot of it was by foot, and the government was chasing him the whole time. Now, one thing I think should be made quite clear, I might have actually missed some slides, actually, but yeah, sorry. One thing that should be made quite clear is that the tactics here, I mean, these people have received tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars in security sector reform trainings after independence, right? This is a post-rebellion movement. How do you turn them into a functioning state and a functioning military? Despite that, their tactics tend to target civilians, right? When I'm fighting with somebody I want to revenge, I tend to go into community and I target the civilians who I feel are aligned with the person I'm fighting against. And so what this means is that when the vice president was fleeing all the way to the Congo, the military who was chasing him attacked any communities they found along the way. They said, you must have been protecting him, you allowed him to come to your community, clearly you were supporting him, and they started killing them as well. Now, these weren't the same ethnic group from the vice president. These were entirely a third group who stayed completely out of the civil war up until this point. But once the government troops started targeting them, not surprisingly, new actors sprang up. And so the first peace process had only 3 actors who were actually negotiating. And now we have a new peace process which had, depending on how you want to count, as many 10 to 20, some people say up to 40 groups who were part of it, because it quickly devolved into even more, which makes, of course, peace process even more complicated. And what you see is, obviously, things being repetitive. If you haven't picked that up already, we had a peace agreement from 2005 amongst some elites. It quickly devolved when the elites started fighting, and the whole country collapsed into war. Agreement was again, particularly between the elites. The vice president gets the exact same position, the president keeps his. And not surprising, when the two men have a fallout, the whole country goes back to civil war. And the obvious issue here is that there's not broad ownership of the agreement. When those two people have a fallout, if the vice president, for example, got fired, or if he left the party, or if he started his own opposition party, separate political party. And not just here, there's been a lot of other rebellions I won't get into in South Sudan, where people lost elections and they go to the bush, they fight, they get a seat in parliament, or they get a ministry, and it creates motivation that if you go out, you fight, then you get more seats at the table. And as a result, that you tend to have a very small ownership over the peace process. People are easily mobilized because they don't know what is an agreement. It's a very clear elite agreement between the top individuals. And it should be pointed out that the people fighting here have had clashes going back to the 90s within the movement. So these aren't new youth who arise, or these aren't the vice president, someone who came around in the last, say, 10 years. These are all people who fought together for the independence movement for 40 years. So it tends to be often, honestly, the same 20 or 30 people who are leading these talks over and over and over again and coming to very similar agreements until they fall out. And so a good example, I mean, after the first agreement, there was a local NGO that I knew, and they translated the peace agreement, which is quite a huge document, actually, 5 different chapters, and took it to the opposition territories in the local language. They wanted to share, they wanted the people to know what was in the agreement, what had they committed to in terms of the justice components, the economic reforms. Immediately, local security confiscated it, they arrested the people, and they sent them back. So there's a clear interest by those who negotiated, not for the people to know what's actually in the agreement. They don't want to be held accountable. They didn't want an African Union hybrid court take them to jail in case they committed war crimes. They wanted the people to be ignorant. Because A, they had no intention of implementing the agreement fully. The only part they really cared about was the first chapter, which is the power sharing agreement, and the other components were just there to pass along. And so here we come to what Berghoff's been doing the last couple of years in South Sudan. We finally had another attempt, a new talk. Now this one is called a revitalized peace agreement, revitalized ARCIS, as they wanted to call it. Agreement for the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan. So it's a very big mouthful. And the whole point is there, this time, the head mediation for IGAD decided, you know what, let's broaden the inclusivity. As already my colleague mentioned, trying to broaden inclusivity, trying to create more people involved is one of Berghoff's key principles. And so this time they invited, now not many, civilians, for example, I think had 11 seats total. Not a lot considering that most of the parties themselves had about 10. However, they had people who were going to the talks. They had people who could push their principles and push their positions. So they had people representing, for example, refugees. They had a person representing women. They had someone representing youth. Now, it should be pointed out, of course, women are about 65% of the population in South Sudan, and yet they have one person representing them at the whole talks in terms of pushing women's issues. Youth are almost 70%, and they also have one person. So, again, it still tends to be a very much elite, old men-driven process. I mean, let's be frank. But at the same time, they did have people in the room who could actually push their agenda. The Berghoff work that we did was to support these constituencies. So the idea was that, look, we're not going to be able to get all women's voices in there, but how do we bring them together to come up with clear positions and demands? So we worked both with youth and women, different coalitions. We organized peace forums to bring them together. There's lots of different bodies. I should just point out that. There's definitely not a unified women's group or youth group that everyone agrees. They come from different positions. The youth in particular, we had all the youth from the conflict actors at the table too. So you can imagine that was quite a tense meeting. But the goal was to try to say, look, beyond what's being debated at the table amongst the old men, what is it that you want that youth feel they're being excluded, and women? What is it that your issues, and not just women's issues, what is it that women want to see in the agreement? It doesn't have to be, women's percentages or things that only focus on interests of women, but what is it that they want to see in the agreement itself? It took quite a while, as you can imagine. One, you have to identify who's actually has a mandate to represent women in different groups. How do you make sure that you actually have not just one ethnic group or, frankly, just a bunch of elites? Again, another level of elites, but if you bring together all the people who speak the NGO language, who are already being paid by the same NGOs to get together, you're not necessarily sure that the people at the grassroots feel represented by them. So the idea is, how do you bring people from different walks of life, from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different political allegiances, and religious groups together to discuss what is it that women would like to see. We also did this with youth. Again, like I said, the youth one, we also brought in the youth representatives of the political parties, which didn't go as well, to be honest, not surprisingly. They were quite hardcore supporters, and it was very difficult to, frankly, get them to talk about things that weren't just at the table. We said, look, the negotiations themselves are already there. These particular issues that you're debating over, power sharing, how many seats for which group, this isn't a youth issue, right? What we want to try to go beyond, what is it they want to see, both in the peace agreement and beyond? What's it would they like to see youth issues addressed? Is it livelihoods? Is it security? And what was it that they would like to see out of that? In addition to that, so we came up with communiques. The women developed a bunch of demands that they want to negotiate, and they gave these positions both to the people who represent them at the talks, same with the youth. And for the youth in particular, they had people who were part of the negotiations, right? They're members of the conflict actors, the negotiating teams. And so they could both within their own organizations push certain things that they wanted, push certain issues from inside. At the same time, because we had such a small group of people with civilian backgrounds in the negotiating team, they're quite frankly overwhelmed with the amount of work. A lot of these debates get into security issues, security sector reform. For example, the youth representative was a woman, a doctor, great, very clever, but she wouldn't tell you straight up, she doesn't know security sector reform details, that's not her background. And so what we also did is work with civil society to bring in who are the South Sudanese civil experts on some of these topics. Bring in some lawyers, bring in some, particularly with the constitutional stuff, bring in security experts to go there and be a support team to the people on the ground. So those who are sitting in the talks in the evening have time to get inputs. Because what they would do is they'd actually give you the language for the next day to be debated around 10 p.m. the night before. Like, here's the language, here's what we're going to debate tomorrow, we want to put this in agreement. So it's 10 p.m., you're already exhausted after a very, very long day, and then you're by yourself and you're supposed to come up with a position. So again, we supported civil society teams to be there with them to say, look, we will work with you with the language, we'll bring in the security experts to help with the security language, and they'll develop it so that way you can get some sleep. And then we also brought civil society people who had leverage with the parties, either, frankly, often because they're related to the people, I mean, if we're really honest, or they had some sort of influence. And so they would actually then go to the parties, knock them on the door, and say, look, we need to talk. We are really upset with the way you voted there today, or the things that you're pushing, and you really try to get the civilian voices included into the document. In terms of quotas, the women got the most obvious. If you want one particular woman issue, they demanded 50% women at all levels of government in the new agreement. They got 35%. Admittedly, they already in the implementation period, they've already ignored those percentages. So again, implementation is obviously another step in a different, so I mean, quotas alone, as Evelyn pointed out, don't necessarily lead to change. You have to know who are the right people. How do you know they're in the room? How do you ensure that it's implemented, right? It's great that women have 35% at all levels of government, but who are those women? And this is always actually a risk. The agreement was actually signed last year in September. And the end did not come together the way people necessarily hoped. There's a few issues that people were stuck on. Frankly, the political parties weren't necessarily completely bought in still, right? There's still a lot of problems between the elites they didn't want to sign. Eventually, the talks moved from Addis Ababa to Khartoum. According to the parties themselves, the Sudanese government essentially strong-armed them a little bit, took them aside and said, you have to sign the agreement. The opposition themselves didn't have much choice, frankly, most of them. A lot of them depend on the Sudanese government for their support. So when their state sponsor tells them you have to sign along across the dotted line, they did it. A few groups refused. They actually said absolutely not. We still principally refuse to sign the agreement the way it is. And they're still fighting. Since then, there's been an implementation period. Now, after it was meant to be actually May, just last few weeks ago, was meant to be the end of the transitional period. Now, the transitional period is meant to be implementing most of the difficult parts of the agreement. Bring in the security people, make a unified military, bring everyone back to the table, do a hybrid court, establish a hybrid court to look into war crimes and hold people accountable. As you can probably imagine, most of that has not been implemented. They're not very interested in particularly implementing things that will hold them accountable. So they really drag their feet, and there's quite a bit of debate. Of course, the parties themselves say there's no money. They first came up with a budget of $1 billion to implement the agreement. After pushback, they dropped down to $250 million. They still haven't got any money. The international community says absolutely not. At this stage, you're spending the money you have on more weapons and helicopters, and so frankly, why would we give you money for the peace agreement when you're actually spending it to rearm your troops? So, to be frank, there's a lot of skepticism. That said, there's a lot of hope as well. I mean, South Sudanese themselves, particularly the normal people, the refugees, the displaced, and of course, even a lot of those who are actually doing most of the fighting, I mean, they're exhausted. People grew up in war. 3 generations have grown up in civil war. They finally got independence and immediately de-escalated again into internal conflict. And so right now there is a very tentative ceasefire. Like I say, there's a couple rebel groups who refuse to sign. They are still holding out. We actually right now are working with the regional bloc's mediation team to reach out to them to try to discuss what would be necessary to bring them on, what kind of negotiations could be developed for that. But that's a separate issue. But a large chunk of it is trying to say, how do we implement it in a way that it doesn't fall apart? The vice president returned for a couple days for a celebration because he's escorted by the Sudanese president and a bunch of other regional presidents. So he finally felt willing to return in their protection. That said, since then he hasn't gone back. They have very long debates over how many troops you would need. And again, the question of security, how do you ensure that the exact same thing doesn't happen between the elite bodyguards that happened the last 2 times? Frankly, no one has a very good answer. I'm not going to pretend there is. There's a lot of discussions out there. But as a result, it's a bit tentative. They just literally a few weeks ago delayed the peace process implementation period 6 more months. So they said, now let's give another half a year. Hopefully now we can resolve it. We will see. There's a lot of diplomatic pressure, as we said, and people hope, but admittedly the situation in Sudan, without getting too complicated, has also not helped. The Sunnis were the ones who pushed through the deal, and if anyone's following Sudan, then you know Sudan has had a lot of other issues and the collapse and the change of government as well in the last few months. And so the people who actually are putting pressure on the parties to sign the deal, they're not there anymore. They've been pushed out. And so there's a lot of worry that those people who felt pressure to sign the deal, that they weren't really interested now, say, well, now the pressure is gone. So we'll see what happens. But sorry I didn't want to end on such a maybe depressive note, but I didn't want to pretend that, for example, that everything suddenly was signed and very happy. But we can open up to questions in case you really want to get into particular approaches or discussions, and we can go from there. Yeah.
Take a round of applause. All right, so this is going to be a little different. We're going to set some ground rules. 3 questions max per person. And again, let's keep them brief. Are there anyone with any questions?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I guess to the both of you, how would you describe the relationship between the Berkel Foundation in relation to like larger entities such as UN, but also regional organizations, you know, within Africa, and perhaps specifically, how do you, for example, in Sudan, end up in the position where, like you just described, could make an effort to co-resolute this conflict?
All right. One at a time? Sure. Yeah, for South Sudan, actually, initially, the initial partnership we had was actually with the African Union. So same kind of thing. We work with local partners. Now, that could be local NGOs, sometimes different institutions we think. In this case, because the African Union was actually expected to lead the peace process when we stepped in, we actually supported a special envoy who had just been appointed. Admittedly, after a while, the African Union didn't have a huge impact. I won't get too much into detail, but essentially internal things at the AU meant that he was waiting on a mandate, and by the time he finally received that mandate, the situation in the country kept changing. And so the regional bloc went back to IGAD, which is a regional group, Rex in charge of that region. So, I mean, for us, again, they're the ones who need to coordinate it. They're the ones who actually are largely involved, and in some ways negative. I mean, if we can be really frank. They're the ones who are going to have to be involved for any peace process to be sustainable. They haven't always been positive influences, different regional countries, but again, they are the ones who have the actual leverage. So when you have the US and the UK and Germany and a few other countries who obviously are trying to support, the leadership has to be locally led, you know, African solutions for African problems, I think. And ideally there with subsidiarity, it should be the regional bloc should be the first if they're available to do it and have the capacity. Again, internal divisions within the regional bloc has actually been why I don't think they were super effective so far. Again, we work closely with the envoy. He's actually very good, but not surprisingly, there's tension between Uganda, between Sudan, between Somalia, for various different reasons, Ethiopia as well. And so those regional dynamics end up playing out often within these scenarios. You had, for example, Uganda openly supported the government when the war first broke out, even sent troops into South Sudan. So they're clearly on the side of the government at the time. The opposition, on the other hand, was largely supported by Sudan. So you essentially had a competition between the Sunnis president and the Ugandan president via proxy war to some extent in Sudan. And so they have to be part of the solution, of course, but it's not so straightforward. I mean, I think for us, like say, we obviously see who actually has the leverage and how do we support them, right? Do we give them technical support, ideally? And in these cases, it turned out the regional bloc said they wanted civilians to be part of the process. They didn't have the capacity to say, go help the civilians organize. They weren't going to do that. So they said there's a gap there. We saw that no one else was doing it at the time, and so we decided to try to step in. But yeah, generally we also work closely with the UN and the AU in other contexts as well. So obviously, I mean, your project is coordinated with UN MSU as well when it comes to research even?
No, it's a peace building one.
Sorry. All right. Yep. So, I mean, yeah, we try almost all of our projects, I believe, we coordinate with them. if not specifically cooperate directly. Sometimes much more exclusive, where we're actually directly supporting their actions, and sometimes we just coordinate closely with them. But
Yeah, just to add like a half sentence on the research aspect and how sometimes, for example, the project that you just mentioned, different bodies of different international or regional organization approach us with the topic that they would like to know more about. For example, the UN Mediation Support Unit wanting to know about how does mediation and peace building impact constitution building, and then we can make a project based on that. So there's definitely a lot of cooperation on the research side of that as well.
All right, thank you. I saw a hand over there.
Hi, my name is Amelia. I'm from Kenya, so this is very close to home. And I'm going to touch on the IGAD subject again because I can clearly see that it's not working. We know that arms pass through Kenya and get into South Sudan, so there's already a failure at the mediators on the table. And another solution is needed if they're going to get peace. And another scenario is these Machar and Salva Kiir, they have luxury homes in Nairobi on opposite ends of town, and it's ridiculous. But what can we do to have another mediating body that's serious
to step in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to be careful here because we work with IGAD. No, I mean, to be honest, this is also why in the very beginning, after the first peace process fell apart, it was hoped the African Union would step in because they didn't have, as you said, the local interests. The Kenyan government has made a lot of money from the South Sudanese. Same with Uganda, frankly. Sudan is completely dependent on them for their oil. So they have so many their own national interests tied into there. They're not going to come at it from an impartial, neutral approach. Again, the African Union in this case wasn't able to take the lead, and so it went back to IGAD. I mean, I've heard different discussions. I mean, some people have called for, there's Enough Project, which is a pretty obvious, it's George Clooney's supporting that one, right? But, they've looked much more into the financial flows, for example. And I know there have been discussions within some circles I've been part of to talk about exactly how do you leverage, for example, the banks in Kenya. It gets very sensitive because it's tied to a lot of other politics. Frankly, for example, if the US or the UK or the EU decide to say, look, Kenyan Commercial Bank, KCB, you need to look into this or we're going to put sanctions on you. And the second they say that, I guarantee the Kenyan politicians will jump because, that is, that said, would any of these Western powers who are UN have the willingness and political will to threaten the Kenyan banks because of that? And that gets into very murky waters because there's a lot of other stuff tied in there, right? It could have much other ramifications and the relationship between them. I think for that to happen, frankly, it would have to be probably the African Union because I think obviously the second you have the US or UK throwing this out there, it's very much colonial, stepping in, telling us what to do. Very understandable. I think the AU stepped in and said, we're going to implement these sanctions on them. I think that would also make them jump. And it's interesting, it's actually what made them come to the table at one point. The African Union actually, at one stage they weren't talking. The AU said, you know what, we're going to put actual sanctions on all you guys and all your financial assets. And the second AU said that, within a week they all turned around and signed something. So the leverage is there, admittedly. But of course there's a lot of other politics. Yeah, I do agree. I think the current IGAD one is unlikely, if I can be so frank, to succeed, particularly with all the other stuff going on. I mean, Ethiopia has their own internal reform process. They're very busy. Sudan is blowing up, so now everyone's not worried about Sudan and not looking at South Sudan. And so South Sudan's kind of just floating along until, frankly, people assume it will slowly fall apart again. That said, the elites, they don't have much to steal right now, frankly. The economy's in complete pieces. So they want some level of security and stability for at least a short time, so that way they can potentially benefit from their positions. I mean, you can get the vice presidency, but if there's nothing there to benefit from, which is, some of them, not all of them perhaps, part of their goals or aims of these positions, then, so they do want some stability so that way they ideally can have opportunities. But the fear, of course, is that they're taking advantage of the ceasefire period to rearm. As you pointed out, true weapons coming from Kenya and Uganda. And the idea is that, or the fears is that it will build up enough that then to just go back to fighting. We'll see. I mean, the one good, not actually good thing, but one maybe slightly silver lining of the Sudan thing is that Sudan situation is that the opposition themselves largely depend on Sudan as a state sponsor. They don't have anybody else. So without weapons coming from there, Sudan has their own internal issues. The opposition is very weak. And so they're not likely to want to go back to start a civil war fully because they don't have any weapons. They have very hardly any fighters, actually. So it could be potentially that everyone is just so weak that they just stay in the peace agreement because they don't have any other options at this point. But everyone is very closely watching what happens in Sudan and hoping that their benefactors somehow get back into power. So we'll see.
All right, we have about 4 more minutes left. Any other questions? Yes.
My name is Shikha and I'm doing a master's degree here. What role or have there been cultural exchange programs between the ethnic groups in Sudan, in southern Sudan? And
Yeah, actually, interestingly, I know an NGO, a local NGO, is doing this in the internally displaced people camps, IDP camps. When the war first broke out, the picture they had there, a lot of people from certain ethnic groups fled to the UN bases for protection. The UN was able to protect them to an extent. There's a number of attacks on the UN bases in which people were killed, but they were able to stay in there. But what you have then is you have these groups of ethnic groups hiding in these UN bases for protection when the other one's outside, and there's a fear that the government calls them rebels. They think that they essentially have a rebel group inside the middle of the city when they want these to close down. But I know some local NGOs actually, interestingly, who said, you know what, we need to get beyond ethnic issues. So they started having weekly cultural exchanges, dances, the different dance groups that they different have, and just on the edge of the camp. So in a place where people would feel safe to mix. So, I mean, they've tried some of this before. It hasn't gone very big. Again, it's largely at this point quite localized. Historically, I mean, they've definitely done it historically. I mean, I know when I've done a lot in the past with interethnic communal violence, when there's been a peace agreement, they've then arranged dances where both ethnic groups can join. That's gone well sometimes. I know in other times, actually, when some men flirted with women from the other community, then they turned around and got shot. So that created some conflicts, admittedly, a couple times, I know, but generally, I think it's a great thing, yeah. But it definitely needs to be worked on, because there definitely is not a national identity. It's very much local ethnic identities or clan identities, but the national identity itself is largely built on the independence movement and not on anything else. They haven't really got beyond how do you build a national identity beyond just the fact that we're fighting for independence. And then we're not Sudanese, they can claim that, but what else unifies them? And that is what is frankly one of the big things that's lacking.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that concludes any questions unless they could be asked in 30 seconds. And given the complexity of the topic, that's probably not the case. However, no need to fear. You are welcome to talk to our guest speakers later on. Let's give another round of applause.